Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar from Prototype to Production. My name is Laura Masterson. I'm the Community Manager here at TypeSafe, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Your presenter today is Jamie Allen. He's the Director of Global Services here at TypeSafe, and he will be presenting. Just a few reminders before I hand things over to Jamie. The call and presentation are being recorded. So if you missed any part of Jamie's presentation or need to hop off early, you can find the recording on our website within a few days. We'll also be sending out a link to the recording and the slides to everyone who registered. If you have questions throughout Jamie's presentation, feel free to insert those into the little chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and I will do my best to address your questions as they come in, flagging a few for Jamie to answer at the end of the session. And I think that about wraps it up in terms of housekeeping notes. And I'm going to hand things over to Jamie. Jamie, thanks so much for presenting today.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everybody. As Laura said, I'm Jamie Allen. I'm the Director of Global Services for TypeSafe. I've been with TypeSafe now for 2.5 years, and I've been helping a lot of customers in a lot of different verticals go into production with our technologies. As a result, I've seen a lot of different kinds of deployment scenarios and strategies that have been used, and what we've tried to do is incorporate that into what we consider some best practices for groups who are trying to leverage the technologies at their fullest efficiency. So, TypeSafe has created something we call the Production Readiness Review. And the idea is to help companies engage in a discussion that will lead to a successful production deployment. Our consultants have had a lot of experience working with large customers, small customers, high load environments, and also lower load environments that just need to be more efficient. And in doing so, we can bring a lot to the table where your team has a lot of broad domain experience that, particular to the way that you need to go into production. Together we can find a way that will be most efficient for your deployment. So why would someone need a production readiness review? It really helps mitigate the risk of unsuccessful technical deployment. Just because people don't realize all of the best practices that are starting to really spring up in the entire DevOps world, if you will. For some companies, this is a completely new way to go into production where you're not using a container such as a WebLogic or a Tomcat or something along those lines. Maybe this is the first time you're using microservices. I was just talking to a company last week, they're a very large insurance firm out of New York that is going to be going into production with their very first Play app in February. And for them, it's really helpful to know that there's going to be someone walking their operations team through the process of what questions and what discussions they should be having up front. I have a really personal story that's very similar to this. Before my wife and I got married, we met with someone who walked us through a whole bunch of questions that, we never really thought about. And we hadn't asked one another beforehand. And I think anybody who's going to enter into a partnership like that, should have those discussions because it's not necessarily something that's part of your everyday conversation, especially if you don't even know about the kind of questions that are going to be thrown at you. This also begins a discussion of how production deployment will take place, just in case, in a lot of startup companies, this may not have been thought through very thoroughly, just because there's such a rush to do so much and get so much work done and push that minimum viable product out the door that the how of deployment may not have been thoroughly thought through. And the great thing about it is it doesn't have to happen and stop the world as far as your entire team. This can all take place in parallel to the actual development effort that is going on for a customer. And also, we're not going to pull anybody in that isn't needed at a particular point in time. That way we can minimize the overall impact on the customer. So will this PRR guarantee successful deployment? No. It will help provide a forum of dialogue which is necessary for a team to go into production. It's not a mechanism for solving problems. It's merely a way to find problems early, beforehand. It will enrich conversations by, laying out a bunch of questions, and then a facilitated conversation will take place beyond that about how to address those areas. First of all, what does this even mean? For some organizations, it may be a question about what non-blocking means as far as threads go on the JVM. Have they been thought through? Have they been identified? Have they been found, and what tools were used to identify them? And once they are identified, how have they been isolated from other non-blocking threads? It's also based on best practices derived from our experiences, with the many different topologies and structures that we've come across with various clients. So our experts will walk you through a series of carefully crafted checklists, and these are really like a pre-flight inspection you see this with pilots. They walk around the plane and make sure that everything looks right. They check the tires, they check the landing gear, they make sure that all the flaps are correct before getting in the plane and actually flying it for every single flight. It ensures the potential blockers to your successful production deployment are on your radar well ahead of your upcoming production launch. So what kind of checklists are going to be identified in this readiness review? First of all, we're going to look at general deployment. Inside of general deployment, we're going to be talking about simple things like, are you using a continuous integration tool? Are you doing continuous deployment? Have you identified peak and endurance load testing, if you will? Are you doing self-hosted repository management? And have you tested external failure conditions using tools like Netflix's Simian Army? Next, and in that particular part, we're not going to engage every developer in the team. We're only going to bring in the project manager, the overall manager, and the architect to get that conversation started. Next, we're going to move into the architecture world. We're going to bring in the architect, the DevOps, and the operations teams. Note that for some organizations, these may not all be involved because there may be DevOps and no operations, or maybe operations and no DevOps. But those are people who are going to be involved in questions about, security, and they're also going to be involved in, the overall layout of the application, making sure that the microservices architecture is defined and the way they're going to interact is defined as well. We're going to talk about performance and quality assurance. In there, we're going to discuss things like whether or not you have a test environment that completely mirrors your production environment. That way you have tested your application to make sure that it can handle the kinds of loads that you're going to run into in production in a very similar environment, because testing it, say, on a MacBook might not be quite as effective. Whether or not you're conducting regular performance tests, the kind of measurement tools you're using, memory usage, measured peaks, all of that kind of information, especially when it comes to measured response times, and whether or not you're calculating that based upon established SLAs, right? Established service level requirements that are, for your particular service need to be met. After that, we're going to go into support and SWAT teams, where we're going to engage the QA team lead, the manager, the architect, and we're going to discuss whether or not each prod service has clearly defined uptime requirements, and how logging and aggregation can be handled, application monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, all that kind of stuff. And beyond that, we're going to go into the actual typeface stack, and we're going to bring in only the developers working at AlCheck, only the developers working in Play, only the leads for the people working with Scala, to talk about various specific items to each one of these. For example, with Play, is a load balancer being used in front of services, and what kind of payloads are being used for web service APIs, what kind of protocols, versioned endpoints, all of that kind of fun stuff. With AlCheck, we're going to talk about whether or not you're using unbounded mailboxes or blocking operations anywhere and how they're being isolated on dispatchers. We want performance benchmarks of all producers and consumers, and whether or not some producers are going to be operating faster than consumers can consume that actual data. For Scala, we're going to talk to you about the kinds of test frameworks that you have in place, and whether or not the various constructs that you're using inside of your Scala will meet your performance requirements. So lots of interesting stuff to be talked about there. And like I said, only pulling in the kind of people who need to be involved in this conversation so that we're not stopping the entire development team from moving forward while this is taking place. Once we've done this, we can go back and do a full review of what's taking place inside of your architecture and your deployment. That way we can craft a production readiness assessment for your consideration, whether or not we think that your application is fully ready to go into production. at which point we're going to provide you with this report. And we're going to score you from each one of these areas, and we're going to weight those scores based upon an internal metric to figure out whether or not on a scale of 1 to 100, your team is ready to go into production. Now, how does the PRR itself work? One of the critical things for us is not engaging your team too much, but at the same time getting the information we need in order to be effective and giving you value with this tool. First of all, we're going to send you the questionnaire. Then we're going to export the results. We're going to review it and collaboratively review the checklist with you. And then we're going to produce this assessment and review it with you. Now, the number one thing that you're going to be getting out of this is the discussion points themselves. Once we send you the questionnaire, you're going to be able to go through it and look at the additional, the questions that are inside of it and figure out, based upon the individual teams that have to be involved in each section, what your answers are and how well you're meeting them. Then the type safe consultant is going to review the checklist with you and prepare to meet the customer. We're going to, figure out the gap areas that should be discussed in depth. They're going to look at the answers that you've given, and they're going to figure out how to best engage you in a discussion about our best practices we've seen in the field with other customers, and also talk about the success areas that you've implemented and we think are fantastic. The discussions are really the focal point. That's where the main value is from the PRR, not the final report itself. Next, we're going to review the checklist with the client. We're going to schedule face-to-face virtual interviews with the stakeholders that are, particularly responsible for each section. And during those face-to-face checklist interviews, we are going to begin to fill out our PRR final report, using the checklist as a starting point, discussing with the customer, capturing the information that we glean from these conversations. Note the gaps, calculate the effect, and prepare the category scores, and prepare the final write-up. Now, the readiness assessment you get is the final deliverable, and it's great to have that. And it will capture information based on the discussions. But hopefully at this point, you're already, as an organization, beginning to make changes based upon the process you've already been through. So if we've identified there are parts of your system that we find particularly worrisome, for example, nobody has ever recovered a database from a backup in a production environment, or at least tested the ability to do that. Or maybe there aren't version deployment artifacts. If that's the case, then hopefully you're already starting to move forward in addressing those particular areas so that your team has these best practices in place. And then finally, we'll schedule a face-to-face virtual review. And by that I mean we don't have to be on site to do this. There's no paying for the expense of a consultant to fly out and meet with your team. We can do this all via virtual meeting technologies. And it will occur very shortly after sending the PRR report to you. At that point, the PRR itself is concluded, and we'll just talk about follow-on action items with you to make sure gaps are addressed. Maybe even help you plan how you're going to implement some of these. Note that we are not consultants whenever it comes to helping you with agile processes or something along those lines. We know best practices that we've experienced from various other customers that we've worked with. It may be the case that in order to go through a fully fledged continuous delivery changeover from the way that you were doing things before to put things into production, you may need to engage somebody else to help you with that. But we can help you plan for that. Now, for companies that are already in production, we have our post-launch PRR, and we call that the health check. Now, it may be the case that you've already deployed an application using type-safe technologies, but you want the same assurance that the way you've deployed them meets the best practices that we've identified. And this could be a shorter process because it doesn't involve quite the same amount of rigor. You're already in production, so we don't have to ask all the same kinds of questions. We'll still do a discovery session with your developers and ops teams, review the application, identify areas for improvement. Then there's this periodic assessment of the use of type-safe technologies for a reactive application. And this is going to provide consistent discipline methodology of analysis. Right? That way you have assurance that you've met a known path for success with an application that's already inside of the production environment. We're going to talk about business objectives and functional technical requirements. We'll talk about configuration and performance analysis, requirements analysis, architecture design and review, best practices, recommendations, and tuning and performance optimization. So how does AlCheck work? In this particular case, it's very similar to the PRR, but for customers that are already in production. It allows the customer to understand areas where they can improve their deployment processes and make their production environment more efficient. So in this particular case, if your team is experiencing headaches with your application in production already, it may help you to go back and do a health check just to figure out where you might have missed something. So are there any questions?
Questions. Jamie, do you want to cover any questions regarding pricing?
Sure. It can depend on the market that you're located in, because we do have a price that we set, but obviously for certain markets, prices have to be adjusted for the various strength of the currency or the economy. In the U.S. market, the cost for the PRR is $7,000 US.
So there's a question that came in about what if someone's using Lift instead of Play, so how do we tackle complementary technologies to the TypeSafe platform?
I think a lot of the questions are still very, very relevant because, for example, for the play-based questions that we're going to ask you, we're going to talk about whether or not you're using a load balancer in front of it. And that's relevant to Lift as well, right? Whether or not you're doing rewrites to a local file system, what kind of payloads you're using, what kind of protocols you're using, version endpoints, whether you've exposed a health check endpoint. These are the kind of questions we're going to be asking you, and they're very relevant to any web framework back end that you might have. At the same time, we do not provide specific expertise around Lift, and there are going to be best practices around Lift that are going to be different than they are for a play-based application. For example, Lift tends to, have users do stateful sessions on servers, and Play tries to push people away from that. Lift is typically deployed in a container, like a Tomcat or a Jetty. On the other hand, Play isn't. So there are going to be some differences here, but for the most part, the best practices around building RESTful applications should be very relevant.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Well, as I mentioned, if you have more questions that you think of in the weeks and months ahead, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will be happy to answer any questions. Jamie, I'd like to thank you again for leading this webinar, very informative and helpful. And we hope to see you all on future webinars. Thanks so much for joining us today.